All right, I'm going to cover everything that you need to know to play Cyno as quickly as possible. No bullshit, just the facts. Timestamps in the description. Let's go. Cyno is a greedy, normal attack focused main DPS who deals consistent damage over a very long elemental burst period. Think of this boy like Electro Xiao, but from Sumeru. He's an edgy boy with a very greedy and self-centered kit, but he can be very fun and rewarding in the hands of the right player. Also like Xiao, Cyno wields a polearm and has a cool looking auto attack animation that you will literally never use. Cyno's elemental burst has its own multipliers, unlike Xiao, so you can actually keep this at level 1 and never think about it again. His elemental skill is a 7-second cooldown short dash forward that deals electro damage. This cannot be used midair and has a small wind-up window, so it's actually not really useful for exploring at all. This is mostly going to be your main tool to recharge your energy during your burst downtime. It also has an enhanced version during his burst, but we'll get back to that later. And speaking of which, Cyno's elemental burst is actually the bulk of his kit, obviously at this point. After activating, Cyno will stance change and start fighting with 2 Razor Claws that convert his normal, charge, and plunge damage to Electro. All of these attacks use multipliers from his burst, but are not treated as burst damage. During the burst, Cyno's elemental skill have a much shorter cooldown and a very different animation, as well as increased damage. It also generates less energy in exchange for all of these buffs. His elemental burst will last a staggering 18 seconds, and as expected, has an 80 energy cost. Also as expected, he loses these buffs if he swaps off to a different character. Alright, this one's a little bit of a woozy, but try to bear with me here. Due to the Featherfall Judgment passive talent, periodically during your burst form, you'll notice this big purple rain around your screen. This is an indicator telling you that your next elemental skill, while the rain is live, will deal even more damage and fire off 3 Duskstalker bolts, which each deal 100% of his attack as elemental skill damage. Obviously, this is a sizable buff, so you're going to want to try to time your elemental skill activations with this aforementioned rain. I believe this effect will appear randomly, but it's not fully random. Generally, I notice at the end of every normal attack sequence, I'll see it appear, give or take a couple of attacks. With enough gameplay though, you can nearly feel when it's going to be live and actually predict it ahead of time. Because all of your damage is actually focused around your elemental burst and your elemental skill, you want to raise these talents to as high of a level as you can with a slight bias towards the burst, since a lot of your elemental skill damage comes from the passive talent multipliers instead of the actual skill multiplier itself. Cyno's other combat talent, Authority over the 9 Bows, I actually have no idea what they think of these names, will increase his damage from the normal attacks, buffed skill from that rain that we talked about earlier, and this will scale with your elemental mastery. Given that this passive talent doesn't actually buff his charge attack, and his charge attack has a really long, awkward wind-up animation, and a lot of the artifact sets that you're going to want to use on him don't buff charge attacks either, I'd really recommend just never using it and sticking to normal attacking and weaving your elemental skill in between your normal attacks. Cyno's Ascension stat is critical damage, and then Cyno has, if anybody cares, an exploration talent that gives him bonus rewards from Sumeru expeditions. And I want to cover how his signature weapon works for those of you who are fortunate enough to have it. This weapon passive gives flat attack scaling with your elemental mastery, and this buff is increased each time you use your elemental skill. You can see the stacks that you have listed on these little sand colored things circling around your character. Obviously, this is a really sizable buff, and you should really keep it in mind because you're trying to have 3 stacks at all times. This actually ties in with the whole sub-theme of Sumeru, which is elemental mastery. Pretty much every character in the region so far has enhanced damage in their kits from that stat. Cyno is absolutely no exception. Even without his weapon, EM substats or even EM main stats will go a long way to increase his damage. And then given this kit's focus on elemental mastery, we can infer that he was designed to be the premier aggravate-based DPS. This is not the only way to play him, and I'll be sure to give other team examples and other playstyles, but I would heavily recommend that you lean into aggravate/dendro-based teams. Also for this reason, I recommend raising this character to level 90, because the buff to reaction damage is going to be pretty sizable. Unfortunately, that means you're going to have to farm another 60 of those goddamn scarabs, but, you know, it is what it is. You'll get them eventually. And I want to quickly remind everybody how aggravate works. I have a more detailed explanation in my Tenari video, and I'll link that above. But basically, aggravate is going to be flat damage that scales with your character's elemental mastery. This is independent of the skill multiplier. It is actually buffed by your damage bonus, or your electro damage bonus, and then your critical damage. It's just important to keep this in mind when you're considering both of his artifact options and all of his other weapon options. Cyno, for the first time in a while in my opinion, is a pretty typical character as far as his scalings go, so he actually has a lot of options. His signature weapon, even at R1, will outperform every other 5-star, even at R5, so if you have that, use it without any questions, and you just skip ahead to the next section of the video. If you're playing him in an aggravate team, make sure to place a slighter greater importance on damage bonus and crit substat weapons, and try to ignore attack percent substat weapons, as attack is actually going to have a much lower efficiency when you're playing an aggravate team, as opposed to running like a damage bonus weapon per se. This is why, if you're completely free to play, I actually recommend the White Tassel. According to Cyno Main's calcs, it's only about 25% worse than his signature weapon, with the primary reason for it falling behind being that its passive doesn't buff elemental skill damage, and has a much lower crit rate. However, it has a lot of things going for it. Obviously, a crit rate substat is always desirable, but the passive effect increases damage bonus for your normal attacks, which can be a huge benefit. 48% is like having a free Electro Goblet. And then when you trigger Aggravate with any of his normal attacks, that damage bonus is actually going to work for the Aggravate because that Aggravate proc is also treated as normal attack damage. Sorry, it's word soup, but just know big number equals better damage. The low base attack isn't a big deal either because Aggravate is independent of attack. Following the same logic, Deathmatch actually gives attack, not damage bonus, so I really don't recommend that you buy the Battle Pass and grab this weapon just for Cyno, as the DPS is only slightly higher than the white tassel, and you also have the condition that you have to be facing more than one enemy in order to trigger this buff. For 5-star weapons that aren't the Scarlet Sands, again, we're not going to prioritize anything that has attack percentage because attack is just not going to be very effective when we're building an Aggravate Cyno. For this reason, R1 Calamity Queller and R1 Vortex Vanquisher actually fall really far behind. Homa, despite the 66% crit damage substat, is only a slight increase over White Tassel, but it's still going to be noticeable. But the primordial Jade Wing Spear is actually the winner here. Even at R1, it's his best non-Scarlet Sands weapon option, and Cyno benefits even more if you're lucky enough to have this weapon refined. So, to recap, if you don't have a Scarlet Sands, just go ahead and use the White Tassel unless you're lucky enough to have a Homa or Jade Wing Spear lying around. If you're interested in more in-depth weapon calculations, I can leave a link to the Cyno Main's Discord in the description below, and then you can go ahead and talk to them. There are actually a lot of 4-piece artifact sets that work on Cyno. If you're a Scarlet Sands haver, then you really should try to farm a 4-piece Gilded Dream set, as all of the extra elemental mastery will make a big difference in its damage. And, just in general, I think Gilded Dream is actually a really strong artifact set, whilst being incredibly generic. I don't think it's better than Emblem by any means, but if you're a veteran player who has obtained their Emblem pieces already, I recommend actually farming this artifact domain for the time being. However, Guild doesn't offer any buffs that can't be made up for in substats. If you still don't have a strong 4-piece, broken sets or perhaps other 4-piece sets, even with Scarlet Sands, will parse higher until you're actually able to farm it up. If you aren't a Scarlet Sands haver, you can get away with a lot more. There are 3 big sets that give buff to normal attacks: Gladiator's Finale, Shimenawa's Reminiscence, and then Echoes of the Offering. Between the 3, Shimenawa's Reminiscence might have the largest buff, but Cyno absolutely cannot afford to lose the energy, so I would avoid this entirely. Echoes is decent if you already own a 4-piece set, but it's not worth farming if you don't, and it's also not in Strongbox. That domain is just a little bit too niche for me to recommend for most people to farm. Also, this set can break if you're playing on more than 100 MS. The proc rate will be a lot lower, and thus you will lose a lot of damage, so it's just not worth it at all for some players. Gladiators has absolutely no caveats and is incredibly cheap. It's been in the game since launch. It's been in Strongbox for absolutely forever. I think most players who are veteran are going to have a lot of good artifact pieces, so I actually recommend this 4-piece between all of the other 3. I forgot to mention this in the original recording, but for both Scarlet players and non-Scarlet players, I also want to bring attention to the 4-piece Thundering Fury artifact set. The 2-piece and 4-piece are both really good on Cyno, as damage bonus for Aggravate is really valuable. This set also lets you spam his elemental skill more often during his burst, assuming you are triggering enough elemental reactions. You can get about 1 additional skill proc in between every rain indicator, but it's finicky and won't always line up correctly. It's something you're actually absolutely going to have to play around with and feel through, but it can be really rewarding if you can learn these timings. This set is also added to the Strongbox, so it's a lot more accessible for a lot of players, and some people might already have a decent 4-piece for it lying around, so definitely give it a try, but I'm not going to guarantee that you're going to have like 100% success with it. Also, I don't think some players actually looked at this set and realized, but all of the new Electro-Dendro reactions were added to this set's 4-piece effect, so you don't have to worry about triggering like Electro Charge or Overload or something. It totally works if you trigger Quicken and Aggravate. Of course, on Cyno especially, you really want to prioritize both substats and correct main stats, and that's going to be a lot more important than your artifact 4-piece bonus. If you can't make a good 4-piece work, just use any 2-piece that you have available until you can farm a full set. For main stats, he's just going to want simple attack or elemental mastery with electro damage goblet and crit. The electro goblet is incredibly important. You cannot get away with an attack percent goblet. Between elemental mastery sands and an attack sands, prioritize the piece that has better substats. However, again, if you have Scarlet, elemental mastery is just always going to be better. Like any other DPS character, you're going to be looking for crit substats, but additionally, Cyno actually has a lot of energy problems, so I recommend farming for energy recharge as your 3rd tertiary substat. His energy recharge highly depends on the team composition that you're going to be playing. If he's a solo electro character, you have absolutely no electro supports, the technical optimal amount of energy recharge is some comical 200%. This is why I never recommend drafting him as a solo electro. Favonius weapons also help a lot if you can give them to your supports. With the 2nd Electro and 1 to 2 Favonius weapons, you can bring that requirement down to 120% to 140%, depending on how sweaty you are and how specific the rotations you're doing. Personally, I've ran my Cyno at exactly 130% recharge with no Favonius weapons and only official sub DPS as his battery. This has worked really well for me, and honestly, if you don't really want to be sweaty about it, just recommend doing that. Generally, it's difficult to know the exact energy recharge requirements without knowing what team you're playing, so definitely just play around with some numbers and see what works and then what doesn't. Most players don't have the level of commitment for builds, so I'll make this section really brief, but Cyno is actually a character that's really hard to build without the Genshin Impact Optimizer. If you don't know what this website is, basically it runs a simulation that tells you the best artifacts that your account can run for a character's damage, and then it can be given constraints, such as like, I don't know, 130% energy recharge minimum. For veteran players, this is definitely the best way to figure out what to play on Cyno. Unlike other characters, there are just way too many different 4-piece or 2-piece/2-piece options that work on him. When you have varying substats on all of these sets, a choice without doing math can be pretty difficult. I'll link resources and tutorials in the description if this interests you at all, or if players in the comments want to ask more questions about it, I can feel free to answer. Moving on to team compositions, I had this chart made with Aggravate in mind as the primary team to build around. Again, there are other options that I can go over, but Cyno is designed around the Aggravate reaction, and it's where I think you'll be the most fluid to play and generally have the most success. I place characters by where I think they're going to fit for actually most players. These placements might not be true for everybody, so don't take this as set in stone because it's not by any means. I also can't go over every single character on this chart. There are likely characters that I missed, so feel free to let me know in the comments if there's anybody that you would have liked me to add. Alright, so Cyno actually has two really big problems that need to be solved when you're drafting his team. First, he needs a lot of energy, as much as he can get. Second, he needs supports that have buffs that can last for the majority of his 18-second burst duration. Starting with batteries, I think I've had and seen the most success with both Fischl and Beto. Fischl is super high DPS due to her kit synergy with Aggravate, and Cyno absolutely loves the extra energy that she can provide. Beto works really well because she offers a decent shield at C1, decent damage, and her burst lasts 15 seconds. If you're lucky enough to have her at C6, her burst also provides a 15% electro defense res shred for opponents that she attacks. Yai Miko also works well, but her turrets only last 12 to 14 seconds due to about her placement time, and then she offers a lot less energy than Fischl. I would really only consider her if you have like premium options like her weapon or some constellations. Dory is actually a highlight from the utility section, as she can be both a healer and a battery because her ultimate will actually restore energy for the active character. But I don't actually think a lot of players have Dory at this very moment, so if you have her, you can go ahead and test her. I actually can't show any footage because I didn't pull her. As far as Dendro characters go, I actually think Dendro Traveler is just the best character from patch 3.1. Her burst is going to last for pretty much most of Cyno's duration, and then when you add on the quicken time duration, it'll actually last for Cyno's entire burst. But she's kind of playing Circle Impact, and she needs a ridiculous amount of energy to be able to function. Because she's cute, I've ended up using Cole for a lot of my Cyno teams. However, her burst doesn't last for nearly as long as the Travelers, so she's just going to be a worse option for pretty much every player. If you have Tenari, don't bother using him either. He has literally no off-field Dendro, and he's better off being played as his own DPS character. I don't want to talk about leaks too much, but what we know of Nahita's kit, assuming it doesn't get changed on beta, she's actually going to be a really good partner for Cyno, and probably the best premium option as she has 20 seconds of off-field Dendro application with her elemental skill. There are a lot of flex options that you can pick from. Really, you just need to make sure that whoever you're picking isn't going to negatively interrupt the aggregate reaction and that you have some kind of support character. Cyno actually has really, really low stagger values on all of his auto attacks, so literally not running a support at all is going to be incredibly difficult to play, unlike maybe Xiao. My personal favorite choices are Zhongli for the 20-second shield, Albedo for the 30-second Blossom and 125 Elemental Mastery buff, Yelan for off-field Hydro, which allows for Hyper Blooms, and also she has a damage bonus, or Kokomi as a healer. Barbara isn't here, but she actually really does work too. Also, Anima characters aren't going to be a high priority, as the Viridescent Veneer set will only shred resistance for about 10 seconds, but when you add cast times and everything, it's going to be even less, so it's questionable. All right, and lastly, I actually want to go over Cyno's constellations really quickly. This part is a little bit unscripted, so bear with me here. So Cyno's C1 is just 20% attack speed for all of his normal attacks. This is further reason to not charge attack on him ever. Attack speed in Genshin Impact is kind of a bait stat on a lot of characters. Unless you're using like a bow or a catalyst, attack speed actually has hit lag problems, so you're not going to be getting like 20% more damage just directly from 20% attack speed. According to Cyno mains, this is about 10% more damage, which is honestly really, really, really low. However, Cyno's C2 is a lot different. Cyno C2 gives him 50% electro damage that he has to stack by auto attacking with his normal hits. Remember from earlier in the video, electro damage bonus is actually super important for Cyno because of how it works with the aggravate reaction. For this reason, this constellation is actually an enormous damage buff. From C0 to C2, you're getting about 40% more damage on Cyno, which is a lot higher than most C2s. It is not going to be as strong as something like a Raiden C2, so I don't recommend this for most players, or really anyone, honestly. You shouldn't pull constellations. That's also why I didn't record constellation pulls. I don't want to encourage people to spend, so it's like I'll upload like the C0 and weapon pulls, and that's about it. You have talent C3 and C5. So C3 is I believe this is your elemental burst. Yep, C3 is your elemental burst up, so this is the more valuable one. And C5 is the elemental skill. C4 just gives him energy, but it doesn't actually give himself energy. It just restores energy for your whole party. So think of this like a mini Raiden ultimate that only works for your other characters. Honestly, it's probably fine, but I really wish it would have actually worked on his own energy problems. That way you don't have to run with this stupid 130%, 140% energy recharge stat. For that reason, I'm not a big fan of this Constellation. And then his C6 is a giant wall of text, but basically what this does is that every time you normal attack with up to 4 stacks, it'll trigger this passive. But not all 3 Duskstalker bolts, just one of them. So basically a lot of your normal attacks will deal additional instance of 100% of Cyno attack as electro damage. Of course, this will let you trigger aggravate more often. So it is like a decent Constellation. It's probably like an enormous damage buff. I don't have the exact number. And I'm not sure if Cyno mains has the exact number either. But because of the huge damage increase on Cyno C2, and because I find this character incredibly fun, I actually did decide to pull for C2, and I'm going to be activating that right now. Anyway, yeah. All right, and that about wraps everything up. This guide ended up being a little bit longer than I'd actually planned for it to be. Honestly, I don't know how long these guides really should be. I see Ziox and Xlice upload guides that are like 30 minutes long, and a lot of people don't really want to watch those, and they really go into detail testing every single weapon on camera. To be honest, like, people just do math for this kind of thing. I don't think it's fully necessary. At the same time, I feel like I don't really like making these guides. It's kind of weird. I'm not really sure. I really want to just give my opinion on characters, especially their gameplay design, and less sit here for, I don't know, 3 days making this guide that just shows you how to play them when most of this information is pretty accessible for most people anyway. But if you guys really like my style of guides and this kind of content, let me know, and I can continue to make it. I'm going to have a better video up next week, which is mostly going to be talking about Cyno's gameplay analysis. I actually really, really like this character. I don't have very many negative things to say about his gameplay. However, I will dig to the bottom of the earth to be able to find every single nitpicky thing that I can. Don't even worry about it. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I have my Cyno build up right here on the camera. So yeah, have a good one.